In the twilight of the 18th century, the British Empire faced a quiet yet catastrophic financial hemorrhage. The epicenter of this crisis was not a battlefield, but a ledger. British high society had developed an insatiable, inelastic demand for Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain. Yet, the Qing dynasty, ruling over a largely self-sufficient agrarian economy, harbored virtually no reciprocal demand for British manufactured goods. Under the rigid Canton system, all Western maritime commerce was confined to a single port and strictly regulated by a guild of Chinese merchants known as the Kohong. Most crucially, the imperial court in Beijing mandated that all foreign purchases be settled exclusively in silver. This mercantilist bottleneck created a massive, unsustainable trade deficit. Millions of ounces of silver were systematically drained from the vaults of London and funneled into the imperial treasury of China. The liquidity of the British Empire was being slowly bled dry to finance a national addiction to a steeped leaf. To reverse this ruinous outflow, the architects of British commerce required a commodity that could forcefully penetrate the closed Chinese market and generate a reciprocal flow of silver back to the West. The entity tasked with solving this macroeconomic puzzle was not a traditional government body, but the British East India Company. Operating as a corporate sovereign, the company possessed its own standing army, minted its own currency, and controlled vast territories across the Indian subcontinent. It was a monolithic engine of early global capitalism, driven by the absolute mandate to maximize shareholder returns. Recognizing the impending liquidity crisis, the company engineered a highly calculated, legally ambiguous pivot to balance the books. In the fertile plains of Bengal, the British East India Company established a strict monopoly over the cultivation of the poppy plant. Indian peasant farmers were coerced through a system of debt peonage to dedicate their lands to poppy rather than subsistence crops. The raw resin was then processed in massive, factory-like facilities managed by the company, standardized into highly potent balls of opium, and packed into wooden chests. This was a state-sponsored, vertically integrated agricultural enterprise designed entirely for export. However, the direct sale of opium in China was strictly prohibited by Qing imperial decree. To circumvent this legal barrier and maintain a veneer of diplomatic plausible deniability, the company deployed a sophisticated dual market strategy. They publicly auctioned the processed opium in Calcutta to private independent merchants known as country traders. The East India Company officially washed its hands of the narcotic at the auction block, while simultaneously issuing the very licenses these privateers required to operate in Asian waters. These private merchant fleets transported the narcotic across the Bay of Bengal and the South China Sea, anchoring at Linton Island, a smuggler's haven just outside the jurisdiction of Chinese customs officials in Canton. There, the chests were offloaded onto heavily armed receiving ships. Chinese smugglers, utilizing fast, shallow-draft vessels nicknamed Scrambling Dragons, purchased the opium with silver and distributed it through vast subterranean criminal networks penetrating deep into the Chinese interior. Analyzing the macroeconomic impact of this shadow network reveals a devastatingly effective system. By the 1830s, the flow of global wealth had violently reversed. The illicit importation of opium reached staggering volumes, flooding the Chinese market and creating a sweeping epidemic of addiction that paralyzed both the labor force and the imperial bureaucracy. The silver that had once flowed steadily into China to pay for tea was now hemorrhaging outward to pay for the narcotic. This sudden massive capital flight triggered a severe deflationary crisis within the Qing domestic economy. The standard copper currency used by the peasantry plummeted in value against silver, effectively doubling the tax burden on the agrarian class and sparking widespread social unrest. The British East India Company had successfully weaponized a biological addiction to correct a macroeconomic trade imbalance, generating immense profits that funded the administration of British India and enriched the financial elite in London. Facing the dual specters of social collapse and economic ruin, the Daoguang Emperor appointed an incorruptible scholar official, Lin Zexu, as imperial commissioner in 1839. Lin arrived in Canton with an absolute mandate to eradicate the opium trade. He recognized that the crisis was not merely a public health emergency, but a systemic assault on the financial sovereignty of the empire. Lin bypassed the corrupt local bureaucracy and directly confronted the foreign merchants. In a decisive and unprecedented enforcement of sovereign law, Lin Zexu blockaded the foreign factories in Canton, holding the merchants hostage until they surrendered their illicit inventory. Over the course of several weeks, Lin confiscated and meticulously destroyed over 2.6 million pounds of raw opium, dissolving the narcotic in massive trenches of water, salt, and lime before flushing it into the sea. It was a catastrophic destruction of corporate capital, representing millions of pounds sterling in lost revenue. The destruction of the opium at Humen was the catalyst that merged corporate grievance with imperial military might. The powerful mercantile lobbying groups in London, heavily leveraged in the China trade, pressured the British Parliament to retaliate. They framed the confiscation not as a legitimate law enforcement action against smuggling, but as an affront to British honor, an unprovoked attack on free trade, and a violation of private property rights. The British government, deeply dependent on the tax revenues generated by the tea trade, mobilized its naval forces. The outbreak of the First Opium War in 1839 exposed a terrifying asymmetry in military technology and industrial capacity. The British deployed a formidable armada, featuring iron-hulled, steam-powered warships like the Nemesis, which could navigate shallow rivers and fire devastating broadsides against the wooden junks and coastal fortresses of the Qing military. The conflict was less a traditional war and more a series of brutal, punitive expeditions designed to systematically dismantle Chinese coastal defenses and sever vital internal supply lines. The technological superiority of the British forces easily overwhelmed the antiquated Qing military, culminating in the blockade of the Grand Canal, the vital artery of the empire's internal economy. Forced to capitulate to prevent the strangulation of his capital, the emperor sued for peace. The resulting Treaty of Nanking, signed in 1842, fundamentally dismantled the existing economic order and birthed the era of unequal treaties. The stipulations of the Treaty of Nanking were a masterclass in coercive economic restructuring. It abolished the Canton system and the Cohong monopoly, forcing China to open 5 major ports, including Shanghai and Canton, to unrestricted foreign trade. It ceded the strategic island of Hong Kong to the British Crown in perpetuity, establishing a secure, deep-water staging ground for global commerce. Furthermore, it imposed a crippling financial indemnity on the Qing government to compensate the British merchants for the destroyed opium and the costs of the war. Beyond the immediate financial and territorial concessions, the treaty embedded insidious legal mechanisms designed to permanently subordinate Chinese sovereignty. The establishment of extraterritoriality meant that British citizens operating in the treaty ports were immune to Chinese law, accountable only to their own consular courts. This created sovereign enclaves within China where foreign capital could operate with absolute impunity, free from domestic regulation or taxation. Additionally, the inclusion of a most favored nation clause ensured that any future concession granted by China to another foreign power would automatically be extended to the British Empire. This mechanism triggered a competitive scramble among Western nations and later Japan, each extracting their own unequal treaties, carving the Chinese economy into distinct spheres of influence. The sovereign control over tariffs, a fundamental tool of macroeconomic policy, was stripped from Beijing and dictated by foreign powers. The insatiable drive for market penetration did not end with the Treaty of Nanking. The underlying friction between a Chinese government attempting to manage its internal stability and foreign powers demanding unfettered access inevitably sparked the Second Opium War in 1856. This subsequent imperial conflict, involving both British and French forces, culminated in the looting and burning of the old summer palace in Beijing, a profound cultural trauma that underscored the complete collapse of Qing defensive capabilities. The resulting Treaty of Tientsin and the Convention of Beijing pushed the architecture of foreign dominance even deeper into the Chinese mainland. They forced the opening of additional treaty ports along the Yangtze River, granted foreign vessels the right to navigate internal waterways, and, most tellingly, formally legalized the opium trade. The narcotic that had triggered the initial conflict was now a legitimate, taxable commodity protected by international law. The legacy of the British East India Company's role in the Opium Wars extends far beyond the historical boundaries of 19th century trade. It established a chilling precedent for the use of state military power to enforce corporate interests and pry open sovereign markets. The matrix of incentives that drove the conflict, the pursuit of liquidity, the circumvention of domestic regulations, and the commodification of human addiction laid the brutal foundations for modern globalized trade. For China, the echoes of that systemic collapse initiated a century of humiliation, a period of internal fragmentation and external subjugation that fundamentally reshaped the nation's geopolitical worldview. The aggressive defense of sovereign borders, the tight control over foreign capital, and the deep suspicion of Western economic pressure seen in modern statecraft are direct responses to the catastrophic vulnerabilities exposed by the opium trade. The Opium Wars remain a stark, enduring testament to the destructive potential of corporate-driven commodity trade when it is backed by the unyielding force of global power.